House of the Dragon is biased. The narrative throughout the show, compared to that of Fire and Blood, is drastically more biased towards the Black faction than it is towards the Green faction. The characters of the Green faction are villainized throughout the show, and almost all of them are presented as unlikable, almost irredeemable villains. As the figurehead of the Green faction, the show makes Aegon the most dislikable, only adapting material from the book that presents him as an awful and despicable character. This is in contrast to the way that Rhaenyra is presented. Rhaenyra is far more positively portrayed. The material that's adapted of her tends to show her in a positive light, and any bad deeds that she's described as having are almost always removed from the show. This positive portrayal of Rhaenyra as a character also extends to the characters of her faction. Their flaws are downplayed, and they're mostly presented as likable characters to the audience. But how exactly is the show biased towards these factions, and how could this be problematic for the future of the story?
That girl is holding the realm together at present. Every man standing round the painted table urges her to plunge the realm into war. Rhaenyra is the only one who's demonstrated restraint.
In the book, Vaemond Velaryon wants to inherit the Driftwood throne, but Rhaenyra wants her son, Luke, to inherit it instead. So Rhaenyra solves this conundrum by having Vaemond killed. She burns him to a crisp and feeds his corpse to her dragon. Now there are some people that feel like the story isn't true. The tale is mostly recorded by Archmaester Gyldain, and in the books it's rumored that the Maesters were the ones that killed the Targaryen dragons. It's said that the Maesters hated magic, and that they had been conspiring against the Targaryens during the Dance of the Dragons. The Targaryens are magical people who control magical creatures, and we know that by the end of this war, the Targaryen dynasty will be destroyed. Their dragons will mostly be extinct. Throughout the show, we see the Maesters whispering in the ears of lords, possibly inciting conflict. Viserys always becomes gradually ill despite ointments and care from the Maesters. Keeping the conspiracy in mind, it's possible that the Maesters were responsible for his death, and it's possible that they tried to smear the Targaryens' reputations too. Viserys is described as a weak king throughout the book, and Rhaenyra is constantly described as being mad. But perhaps the Maesters were only trying to tarnish their image. Perhaps the tale about Vaemond was made up by the Maesters. Or perhaps it was not. There are certain facts that need to be considered about the story, and the context in which it is told has to be factored into that consideration. Certain details in the story are factual, and they cannot be denied, even by the show itself. Vaemond does die after he tries to press his claim, and Rhaenyra and her faction were the biggest beneficiaries of this political crisis. Also, Luke does become the next in line for the Driftwood throne, despite the claims of Corlys's other nephews, and even the claims of Laena's children. So Rhaenyra certainly achieves her goal. There's also no contentions about who was involved in the crime. Usually, in Fire and Blood, there's multiple sources which contradict each other when it comes to big political events like this one. But this story is particularly interesting because it doesn't have any contradictive sources. Daemon indeed kills Vaemond, but on the show, the only difference is that Rhaenyra is not involved. The show shifts the blame entirely onto Daemon, which it does a lot when it comes to events like this. Events where Rhaenyra is said to have done something bad. In the book, Rhaenyra is responsible for Vaemond's death, but on the show, the responsibility lies solely with Daemon. In the book, during the negotiations that follow Aegon's coronation, Rhaenyra behaves undiplomatically and makes threats against Aegon. But on the show, it's Daemon who behaves undiplomatically, and it's also Daemon who is the one who makes all of the threats.
She can have her answer now, stuffed in her father's mouth along with his withered cock. Let's end this mama's farce.
In the book, Rhaenyra is said to be intent on making war because she blames the Greens for the death of her father. But on the show, Rhaenyra is peaceful and doesn't want to go to war, while Daemon is the one that's angry and urges her to.
Well, the enemy have declared war. What are you going to do about it?
Rhaenyra's ruthless ambition, as well as her agency, is taken away from her and given to Daemon. The show wants Rhaenyra to appear peaceful, good, and generous, so that she appears more likable and the audience can favor her. She's a loving mother, and she's presented as a capable queen. Her flaws are downplayed in order to present her as the likely candidate for the Iron Throne. There are even scenes that are added to the story to try and present her as though she has a divine claim, that even the gods are on her side. The narrative is biased towards Rhaenyra, and the bias extends to the characters that support her. Daemon is a murderer. He murders one of his wives and assassinates Vaemond Velaryon, but the story never truly condemns him as a bad person for these actions. Firstly, Daemon suffers no consequences for any one of these actions, and the narrative simply moves on from them, sweeping them under the rug so that we don't dwell on any of them. Rather, the show justifies Daemon's violence and impetuousness. We see that Vaemond's violent nature is usually as a result of him trying to get his brother's attention. Daemon loves his brother. That's communicated clearly throughout the show, and he desperately yearns for his brother's approval. And it's as a result of this tragedious desire that the audience empathizes with Daemon so much.
You've only ever tried to send me away to the Vale, to the City Watch, anywhere but by your side. 10 years you've been king, and yet not once have you asked me to be your hand.
Why would I do that?
Because I'm your brother.
Corlys is also a character that the audience empathizes with. He is a skilled warrior, and that's very cool, but he's also a wise counselor and a devoted husband. His ambitions for the Iron Throne are not even for himself, they're for his wife.
By all rights, you should be Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. You were robbed of the crown.
I never wore the crown.
He wants to win the throne for her, because he believes that his wife was robbed during the Great Council of Harrenhal. It's a sweet gesture, and so the audience empathizes with it. The only flaw with Corlys is the fact that he is overly ambitious, to the point that it leads to the death of his children and that of his brother. But again, the show doesn't want us to think about this, because Corlys himself doesn't think about it. He brushes Vaemond's death aside and easily forgives and supports the very people that were responsible for the deaths of his children. And Rhaenys does this as well. We empathize with Rhaenys because she's constantly insulted by people referring to her as the queen who never was.
I would humbly ask for the favor of the queen who never was.
But the story doesn't want us to dwell on the fact that Rhaenys is a hypocrite. Rhaenys tells Alicent that she has always been in servitude to men, and yet Rhaenys herself has always been in servitude to men. She herself has always been in servitude to her husband's wishes and decisions, and she also helps Rhaenyra by supporting her son's claim instead of supporting Baela's claim. She scolds Alicent about upholding the patriarchy, and yet here she is, upholding the patriarchy. Rhaenys is clearly a hypocrite, but we're not supposed to dwell on this because no one ever tells her this, so the narrative just moves along and presents her as a likable character. The story is clearly biased towards Rhaenyra and anyone who supports her, and the writers try very hard to make us see them as the good guys of the story. Aegon and his supporters, however, are presented in the opposite direction. The story presents them as the villains.
I would rather feed my sons to the dragons than have them carry shields and cups. For your drunken usurper cunt of a king.
The characters of the Green faction are constantly demonized throughout the show. For them, the story takes the opposite approach that it did with the Black characters. It brushes past their good qualities, but it emphasizes their flaws. Some characters in the Green faction don't even have any redeemable qualities, so it's difficult for the audience to empathize with them in the same way as the Black characters. Otto and Alicent are perhaps the only characters that have redeemable qualities to them, but still, the story emphasizes their flaws and their worst qualities. Otto, for example, is presented as a cold father and a ruthless politician, a man so manipulative and devious that he is not above manipulating and deceiving his own daughter. Alicent seems to pick this behavior up from him, trying her best to manipulate Aegon. Throughout the story, she is presented as a terrible mother who doesn't seem to be loved by either of her children. And this is an interesting way to portray Alicent's character, because in the book, it's almost insinuated that she was a good mother to her children. She visits Helaena frequently, and she plays with her children whenever she does. But on the show, their relationship is cold. Alicent is even portrayed as being abusive towards Aegon, as she is frequently screaming at him or hitting him, privately and publicly. This isn't something that was adapted from the book, but maybe it's because the Maesters were biased towards her. Or maybe it's because the show is biased against her. Perhaps the show makes these changes to try and villainize Alicent's character. This is something that it also does with Sir Criston Cole's character. In Fire and Blood, Sir Criston Cole is an intelligent advisor for the Green faction. When Viserys dies, Alicent goes to him, not Otto Hightower, and it's their idea to call the Green Council. During the meeting, Sir Criston has a voice. It's his idea to crown Aegon. But on the show, Sir Criston is reduced to a simp for Rhaenyra. He is extremely vindictive and irrationally violent, even to the point of putting Rhaenyra's children in harm's way just to get back at her. The show clearly demonizes him, making him dislikable. The story adapts the worst of these characters so that we, the audience, don't root for them. The Lannisters are misogynistic, and Larys is a kinslaying psychopath. Larys is also sexually exploitative, so this just makes him even more despicable. The Green faction is just an assortment of despicable characters, but they all almost pale in comparison to the figurehead of their faction. The Green faction's members support Aegon's claim, but Aegon himself is not an inspiring leader. He is a fool, a drunkard, a sadist, and a grapist. Aegon is one of the most demonized characters within the Green faction, and the show does this deliberately. It specifically chooses sources from the book that present Aegon in a negative light, and this is despite contradictive sources that suggest a different version of Aegon's character. For example, the show decides to adapt Aegon as a grapist and a sadist. We know this because he traumatically assaults one of his female servants, and he entertains himself by watching children fight to the death in pits. This is an interesting choice for the show to make, because this version of Aegon's character was described by Mushroom. Mushroom is one of the sources of the Dance of the Dragons, but he is specifically Rhaenyra's fool and companion. Mushroom has been Rhaenyra's companion since Rhaenyra was a little girl, so his accounts of the dance are likely biased towards her. That's why his account of Aegon's character should be taken with a grain of salt. It's not implausible to think that Mushroom could have embellished these details in order to demonize Aegon. And furthermore, we must consider the fact that Mushroom wasn't even at King's Landing to be a witness to Aegon's behaviors. The source who was there was Septon Eustace, and he gives a very different account of Aegon's character. Septon Eustace admits that Aegon was a bad husband and that he was unfaithful to his wife, preferring to spend his time with whores, rather than to be spending time with her. He adds that Aegon had a favorite whore, a girl who was the daughter of a wealthy merchant. But Septon Eustace says that Aegon liked this girl, and he adds that he took very good care of her. Now this account from Septon Eustace is likely to be biased towards the Greens. The Hightowers are very religious, and the faith is based on Oldtown, so it's likely that this account is a bit flattering towards Aegon. However, his account of Aegon's character is perhaps the most accurate one. We know that Aegon was ignored by his father, and we know that it was constantly being manipulated by his mother. It therefore makes sense for him to seek affection outside of his family, outside of these people who are constantly ignoring or manipulating him. This source makes Aegon a bit more empathetic to the audience. He is an understandable, yet still a flawed character. Yes, he is unfaithful to his wife, but he is also a character who's seeking genuine love and affection. And this is perhaps a more accurate version of Aegon's character. But the show doesn't adapt this version of Aegon's character. Aegon, just like many of the characters of his faction, is demonized throughout the story. The show is biased against him and his faction.
The struggle between good and evil is central to fantasy, and indeed in some ways central to most fiction. It's certainly a worthy subject for fiction. But where I think I differ is I regard the struggle between good and evil as being waged within the individual human heart.
Most of George R. Martin's stories try to avoid the trope of having clear heroes and villains throughout the narrative. Instead of a good side and an evil side, George writes his characters so that the battle of good and evil is something that the character has to reconcile with within themselves. This actually makes the story a lot more compelling because the characters feel real, as if they are real people. Every character within the story is capable of good and evil, and sometimes a character will do something good but for the wrong reasons, or maybe sometimes do something evil but for the most noble reasons. Suddenly, the character is understandable and real to us, and maybe even empathetic to a certain degree. That's why fans can be left feeling so divided about whether certain characters are good or bad in the story. But this doesn't really happen with House of the Dragon, because the story is so biased and one-sided. Because of this bias, the story takes a side and presents certain characters more favorably than others. We're supposed to view the Black faction's characters as the heroes of the story, and we're supposed to view the Green faction's characters as the villains. The discussion of who's good and who's evil in the story is far less nuanced, because the story itself makes it clear to us, and I believe that this will be a problem for the story going forward. The characters of the Black faction do some terrible things in future events, and the characters of the Green faction do some good things in the story. But will the show try to change those events as well? How will the bias of the show impact the story going forward? What do you think? Let me know down below in the comments section. And if you like this video, click the thumbs up and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Peace.